has been 1 month since I purchased my Gravity Bullseye Monster. Alright, it's been an interesting first month with this bike. We're deep in the middle of the freeze-thaw cycle here in Minnesota, so I haven't really been able to take the bike out on mountain biking trails a whole lot, and it's seen even less snow. Over the last month, I've put about 150 miles on this fat bike. With all that being said, I do feel like I've put the bike through its paces over the last month, and if you haven't seen any of my recent videos, I have a montage that will highlight all of the cool things that I've been doing with this bike. That way you can gauge my riding style to yours and take everything else that I say in this video with a grain of salt. Oh yeah. Hell yeah! There. Alright, so the subjects that we'll be talking about in today's video go as following. We're going to talk about the ordering / unboxing process of this bike. We're going to talk about what I had to do to assemble the bike out of the box. Alright, probably one of the most important things to talk about in this video is the ride quality of this bike. I'm going to break it down into 3 separate categories. The first one being road and gravel handling, the second one being light single track, and the third one being more extreme single track, including like features and things of that nature. Next, I'll be talking about the bike's frame and fork as a unit. Then I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the componentry by talking about the wheels and tires specifically. And then I have less comments about the rest of the components, but I will talk about the rest of the components in the last section. Alright, so in the midst of a pandemic and a bike shortage, I ordered this bike, and about 2 weeks later, it was at my door. Not gonna lie, most of the first night was kind of spent worrying because I had paid for the bike. The money came out of my account immediately, but I hadn't received an email that confirmed that I had purchased a bike from them. This went on for 2 days, and I got more nervous, but eventually they sent me a confirmation email on Monday, which makes sense, and then I realized everything was probably gonna be fine. Alright, so the unboxing process of this bike went fairly smooth. Pretty much everything you see here, except for the seat and like the pedals, came out in one piece. At first glance, I didn't really think that the bike would have experienced any shipment damage. The box looked pretty intact to me, but before I pulled the bike out, I did notice that the bike was leaning against the rear derailleur on the box, and when I went to inspect the outer side of the box, it became apparent to me that the cardboard where the derailleur was resting upon was very tender and even had a rip in it, which made me question whether the bike had experienced some damage in shipping. Whilst I wasn't 100% sure during the build video or the unboxing video On the second day of riding this bike, it became utterly clear to me that I should just replace the rear derailleur hanger with a spare one that was sent in the box. So, indeed, the derailleur hanger did suffer damage in shipment. Now, I'm not necessarily calling that a bad thing. It's awesome that they sent a spare derailleur hanger for me to fix it with. However, I do feel like this is kind of a bigger problem that maybe a new rider who this is their first fat bike or their first time assembling any sort of bike might see as a bit of a challenge. Alright, assuming that you have knowledge on assembling bikes, assembly on this was pretty straightforward and easy. If you don't have knowledge on assembling bikes, it can still be done very easily. You're just going to probably want to watch a handful of YouTube videos before you actually dive in. Now, there are plenty of videos on how to do all these things, so I'm just going to list off the tasks that I had to do to assemble this bike. I had to insert the front wheel. I had to clamp on the handlebars to the stem, and I had to line up and tighten the stem with the front wheel. I had to line up the brake calipers with the rotors. And lastly, this isn't something that you will have to do necessarily, or at least I can't attest to how well the shifting was indexed from the factory with this bike. But since I had a bent derailleur hanger, I had to replace the derailleur hanger and re-index my rear shifter. Alright, so for ride quality, I said that I was going to break it down into 3 separate categories. On pavement, this bike kind of handles like you'd expect it to. It's got big tires, therefore it doesn't go crazy fast. With that being said, these tires in particular do roll a lot faster than I expected a fat tire to roll. On gravel, the bike handles, again, kind of like you'd expect it would. It's a mountain bike at its core without suspension, with even wider tires than your standard mountain bike, so it doesn't struggle for grip on gravel. The big tires kind of act as like floaty pillows over the gravel, which makes it kind of more like a bumpy road. So it pretty much is just like a magic carpet ride when you're on gravel with this. I wouldn't say that it's very fast when the gravel's hard packed, but it's also not slowing down when the gravel gets loose. So it just kind of is consistently chugging along. I kind of like riding gravel on it, but I don't think I would actually regularly choose to ride gravel on it if we weren't deep in the freeze-thaw cycle. Alright, for single track, I have gotten the opportunity to take this bike out a couple times. Now, from what I can tell, I actually really like the way the bike handles. It feels like it's built to go on the trails. I was kind of nervous at the price point if I was going to get a bike that was all show and no go. I think the bike can withstand most trails. I honestly feel like it climbs like a beast. It feels sturdy when going off of drop-offs and jumps, but that's going to be kind of more of my next subject. But it also feels really sturdy when going fast, and it doesn't feel like the bike is just going to like fall apart on you. Nothing's really come loose, and obviously trails are a little bit more rugged than the road and the gravel stuff that I was doing with the bike. So it's pretty fair to say that the bike is holding up well. It still doesn't really make any noises, and it still feels like a brand new bike. Alright, the third category of ride quality is riding this bike on features. Now, like I've said, a lot of the single track has been closed. Some of the single track that I visited once I got this bike was places that I hadn't been to before, so some of the features were either outside of my skill level or I just didn't feel comfortable necessarily doing them at my first time there on a new bike. Just those two things working against me. So the types of features that I've done on this bike are drop-offs, I've done rock rolls, I've done log rolls, I've done some mild jumping with it. And again, like I said in the last subject of ride quality, I was a little unsure at first how rough I wanted to be with the bike because I wasn't sure what it could take. I wasn't sure if I got something that wasn't actually built to handle those sorts of impacts. But since I've done them, like I said, the bike has held up extremely well. It honestly feels really composed. I think that it's built well, and it seems like it's going to be a contender for me to take out to the trails on any day, even if it's not winter. Alright, so the frame and the fork of the Gravity Bullseye are fully aluminum. The frame sports integrated cable routing, as well as 2 water bottle cage holders, and 2 mounting points up top for a pannier rack setup. It also has a hole drilled for a rear fender. The frame comes with a threaded bottom bracket. The fork comes with 6 bolt mounting points, as well as a bolt for a fender in the front. The bike is running post-mount brake calipers, front and rear. The rear wheel spacing is 170 millimeters quick release, and the front wheel spacing is 135 millimeters quick release. All right, let's talk about some of the pros and cons of this frame. The pros are that the frame is relatively cheap whilst also being relatively lightweight, and the fact that they've taken the time to put things in like internal cable routing means that they're probably thinking a little bit about the consumer at the very least. Another pro is the bike seems to have a decent bit of mounting options. Probably the biggest downside, and I'll address this a little bit more in the subject of the wheels, is the rear hub spacing. Being that 170 millimeter quick release, a lot of bikes nowadays come with through axles, and I think they're 190 in the rear. The situation's pretty similar with the wheel spacing and the fork, and like I said, I'll address that a little bit more in-depthly in the next section of the video. Separate from the wheel spacing of the front fork, there is one other con, if you will, with the front fork, and that is right here in the steer tube. This bike runs a 1 1/8 inch non-tapered steer tube. Now, most modern mountain bikes have tapered steer tubes. I say con with quotation marks because Surly, a very popular fat bike manufacturer, still uses 1 1/8 inch steer tubes because they say that it's nice to have some compliance and a little bit less stiffness in this area on a bike that's fully rigid. However, let's say you do want to upgrade your fork, that steer tube diameter might cause a problem. I don't know much about it, but supposedly there is a headset that you can install that will allow you to run a tapered fork in a non-tapered frame, but I'm not entirely sure how well it works or if it's advisable. So as of right now, I would say that options for upgrading this fork are limited. Alright, so up next are the wheels and the tires. Now, this is probably one of the areas that they've compromised the most to get the bike at a fair price point. Getting nice rims is really expensive. Even major manufacturers usually put fairly cheap rims on some of their nicer bikes. Now with this bike, like I kind of addressed in the frame section, the biggest downside about these wheels is the limited ability to upgrade them. There's not a lot of high quality stuff made with 170 rear spacing and 135 front spacing. I don't know much about through axle conversion kits, so I don't really want to talk about them. I want to talk about the information that's been presented to me, and from what I know, it isn't at least easy to get different wheel sets to work with these frame dimensions. With that being said, these rims are 80 millimeters wide, which means that most fat bike tires are going to sit on them properly. They're not going to be too bulbed out. All right, I have many opinions about these tires. These V-Mission Commands, I hate them mostly, but sometimes I love them. Honestly, I'm about to throw a bunch of upgrades on this bike, and I think I'm going to wait to take these tires off, even though I have a lot of strong negative opinions about them, because they do one thing really well, and that's rolling fast. These tires are pretty quick. Like, honestly, like I said about pavement, like this bike exceeded my expectations. These are some really good, fast rolling tires. Honestly, come summertime, I might even run a V-Mission Command in the rear again. With that being said, I have a lot of beef with how the tire performs in the front. In the front, the tire has a lot of self-steer unless you pump it up really hard. Once the front tire is pumped up pretty hard, you can say goodbye to grip on off-road terrain. So it's kind of like, which pill do you want to swallow? The one that makes you go not so quickly on the road, or the one that makes you not be able to control the direction your bike is going on the road? And it's not just on the road that the self-steer plays a factor. It also sometimes comes into play off-road when the ground is very hard packed. Now, when I say self-steer, I don't mean the bike is literally trying to steer itself. What I mean is there's like subtle resistance and subtle feedback where the side knobs of the tread are touching the ground and they try to put the bike back upright again. And that's what makes this a really good rear tire, is because your rear tire is going to want to stay upright. It's going to want to keep rolling, and it rolls fast. But in the front, when you're trying to lean and when you're trying to turn the wheel, you don't need it fighting you. And like I said, it's not actually trying to steer itself. Like, if you stay sure-handed and you continue to push the bike in the direction that you want it to go, it will go that direction. But having that subtle sensation that the wheel wants to straighten itself out, is weird, and it's not ideal, and it's not always confidence inspiring, especially to a new rider. Alright, so looking at the remaining components of the bike, I feel like they didn't make as many big compromises with the rest of the bike as they did on the wheels and the tires specifically. For drivetrain, we are running a Shimano Allevo 2 chainring setup up front, and in the rear we're running the SRAM X4 8-speed, and that for me personally has been enough. Like, I've honestly only tapped into that lowest gear a handful of times, and honestly when I have, I've regretted it. I've wished that I've stayed in the second easiest gear. It can climb up most scenarios. Honestly, I've taken this bike up things that I've never climbed on any other bike. So I'd say that the gear ratios are set up pretty good. The bike is completely stock. The whole point of this review was to show you guys a completely stock bike. I will say, however, that I have changed out the bolts that hold on the crank set, and that is because I simply wanted a bolt that I could use with an Allen wrench, and I've taken apart a lot of bikes in my days, so I have spare crankset bolts. But yeah, the bike normally comes with one that needs 15 millimeter socket wrench to get out, and I don't carry socket wrenches with me when I'm biking, so I replaced it with a bolt that uses an Allen wrench. I think it uses an 8 millimeter Allen wrench. Alright, I knew this before I even put the pedals on the bike, and honestly the fact that I made it an entire month with these pedals on the bike is astounding, especially when you consider the fact that I've had the replacement pedals sitting in my shop for the last 3 weeks using these awful pedals. They don't spin well, they don't grip well. Don't put them on the bike. If you can do anything while you're waiting for your Gravity Bullseye to get to your house, go to your local bike shop or go on Amazon, order some pedals, and have those put on the bike immediately. Don't even try to use those, like, seriously. Pretty classic from what I've found with Bikes Direct. What you get in the handlebar stem area is all decent quality parts, but they're from like last generation. So these are 25.4 millimeter clamp bars. Nowadays, most bikes come with 31.8 millimeter clamps or even 35 millimeter clamps. So this is a lot thinner of a bar than what you'll see on a newer mountain bike or a newer fat bike. I don't think they're necessarily bad quality bars, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad quality stem because stems are bar width specific, but they aren't really what you've come to know and love if you own other bikes. For me, I knew out the gate that I wanted to replace both the stem and the bars. I felt like the reach on this bike was a little bit long for me, so I wanted to have a shorter stem. I knew that I wanted thicker bars because it just kind of feels nice to have something beefy when you're landing off of jumps and things like that. The Tektro brakes are fine by all means. I've heard a lot of people say that you don't want to be able to stop super quickly in the winter, and if you're a rider who's prone to panic braking, these might be really good brakes for you because I feel like you really have to dig into the brake lever. Once you dig into it, you can get the tires to skid all day, you can get really quick, immediate stopping, but I've reset the pad distance a few times. I feel like nothing really happens till you get to like right here. The only other problem that I really have with this frame, and this might be semi-personal, but also it presents a real-world problem for everyone who buys this bike. From what I could see in the pictures, I honestly didn't think the paint was going to look like this. I'm not necessarily mad that the paint looks like this, but it is a very unusual finish. More importantly than what the color looks like is the fact that this paint has been chipping off really easy. I haven't crashed the bike. I honestly don't know why, but I have scratches and chip paint all over the bike, and I'm coming to grips with the reality that I might have to get this bike repainted before next season, and that's kind of frustrating. Alright, so probably the most important question at the end of this all is, am I happy with my purchase, and do I regret it? I am happy with my purchase, and I don't regret it. Here's why. This bike can do everything that you would expect a fat bike to do. I'm not saying it does it the best, but it also doesn't do it quite as poorly as a lot of the cheaper alternatives. This bike comes in at $200 to $300 cheaper than the cheapest bike any major manufacturer offers as far as fat bikes go. And whilst there are some heavy downsides to come to grips with when you buy this bike, you're not making a compromise on the bike's ability to do fat bike things. You're making a compromise on the bike's upgradability. And I feel like choosing to spend $200 to $300 less on a bike means you're probably less likely to do major upgrades anyways. So if you're already saving money out the box that you're not planning on spending, depending on who you are, this could actually be a really good option for you. Just buy it, ride it, don't ask questions. Like, it does everything a fat bike can do. It's got clearance for 4-inch tires in the back, clearance for 5-inch tires in the front. It's a fully aluminum frame with a fairly tough drivetrain setup. Change the tires, make sure that the bike fits you well, and this is $600 pretty well spent if you ask me. If you like the video, you know the drill. Be sure to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more fat bike content. We've got lots of rides coming out, and now that I've done this 1-month review, I'm about to go into full upgrade mode on this bike. There's a lot of things I've been wanting to do to it, and a lot of parts sitting in my bike shop gathering dust, and I can't wait to throw them on this bike. So please be sure to check that out.